I watched my father's hand tremble slightly as he squeezed a tiny glass vial over my fiancé's plate. 1 drop, 2 drops, 3. Then he slipped the vial back into his jacket pocket like it was nothing, like he hadn't just tried to send the man I loved into anaphylactic shock. My own father, at my engagement dinner. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe, because what I did next changed everything. Let me take you back to the beginning so you understand how we got here. I'm Hailey. I was 26 years old when this happened, a registered nurse working the ICU at Boston General. My family, the Caldwells, owned one of the most successful restaurant chains on the East Coast. Caldwell and Grace started as a single seafood bistro in Cape Cod back in the 80s when my grandfather, Arthur Caldwell, turned his fishing boat money into a waterfront dining room. By the time my father, Richard Caldwell, took over, the chain had expanded to 23 locations across New England, with 2 Michelin-starred flagship restaurants and a catering empire that served every high-society wedding and corporate gala from Boston to Newport. My mother, Vivian, came from Connecticut old money. Her family had been in real estate development for generations, and when she married my father, she brought connections, capital, and an obsession with social status that infected every corner of our household. She ran the front-of-house operations and public image for Caldwell and Grace like a military campaign. Every napkin fold, every floral arrangement, every press photo was curated to perfection. She once fired a hostess for wearing the wrong shade of lipstick. Then there was my younger sister, Brooke. 23, gorgeous, a Boston University business graduate who had stepped seamlessly into the role of marketing director at the family company. Brooke was the one they paraded at industry events, the one whose Instagram was linked on the company website, the one my father introduced at galas as the future of Caldwell and Grace. She had our mother's bone structure and our father's charm, and she wielded both like weapons. Me? I was the family disappointment, not because I failed. I graduated summa cum laude from nursing school. I was one of the youngest ICU nurses at one of the best hospitals in Boston. My patients' families wrote letters to the hospital praising my care. But none of that mattered to the Caldwells because I had refused to join the restaurant empire. The expectations had been clear since childhood. Brooke would handle marketing and expansion. I would manage operations, eventually stepping into my father's role. They had my career planned before I could spell my own name. When I told them at 17 that I wanted to study nursing, my mother actually laughed. She thought I was joking. When she realized I wasn't, the Cold War began. My father stopped attending my school events. My mother would introduce me at parties as our eldest. She's still figuring things out, as if my nursing career was a phase, like a teenager dyeing her hair purple. Holidays became interrogations about when I would come to my senses. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, the same script. The restaurant industry is in your blood, Hailey. You're wasting your potential. You could be running a $100 million operation, and instead you're emptying bedpans. I learned to swallow it, to smile through the jabs and redirect conversations, to find my worth in the lives I saved at the hospital instead of the approval I would never earn at home. The one person who had always understood me was my grandfather, Arthur. While my parents saw nursing as beneath the Caldwell name, Grandpa Arthur saw it as the most Caldwell thing I could do. We built this family by feeding people, he told me once, sitting on the porch of his Cape Cod house, watching the boats come in. You're nourishing people in a different way. Don't let anyone tell you that's less valuable. He passed away when I was 24. The grief nearly broke me. But what I didn't know until 6 months later was that he had left me something extraordinary. His attorney contacted me on a Tuesday afternoon. Arthur Caldwell had established an irrevocable trust in my name, funded with his personal savings and his original ownership stake in Caldwell and Grace, worth roughly $14 million, to be transferred on my 27th birthday or upon my engagement, whichever came first. He had also left a handwritten letter. I keep it in my nightstand to this day. It read, "Hailey, you chose compassion over comfort, service over status. This money is my way of making sure no one can ever use financial pressure to pull you away from who you really are. Build your own life, sweetheart. You've already made me prouder than any restaurant ever could." I didn't tell my parents about the trust. Something in my gut said to keep it quiet. That instinct probably saved my life. Now let me tell you about Marcus. I met Marcus James Thompson at the hospital. He was a high school teacher who had been admitted after a car accident left him with a broken collarbone and 3 fractured ribs. He was the worst patient I ever had, and I mean that as the highest compliment. He kept making the other nurses laugh so hard they couldn't take his vitals properly. He asked me to rate his hospital gown on a scale of 1 to 10 for fashion. He graded my IV technique like a homework assignment. B+, solid effort, but your bedside manner needs more dramatic flair. I fell for him somewhere between his terrible jokes and the way he talked about his students like they were his own kids. Marcus grew up in Dorchester, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. He put himself through college on scholarships and became the kind of teacher who stayed late tutoring students and spent his own money on classroom supplies. He drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic and lived in a modest apartment in Somerville with more books than furniture. My parents despised him before they even met him. When I told my mother I was dating a public school teacher, she set down her wine glass so carefully I could hear the crystal touch the marble countertop. A teacher, she repeated, as if I had said criminal. From where? When I told her Dorchester, she didn't even respond. She just picked up her phone and started scrolling. The conversation dismissed. My father was more direct. He's after our money, he said over a phone call I hadn't even wanted to make. These people always are. End it now before it becomes embarrassing. These people, I'll never forget those words. Despite everything, Marcus was patient. He didn't push back against my family. He didn't make ultimatums. He just loved me quietly and consistently, showing up for every hospital shift change with coffee, sitting through every awkward dinner with my parents without losing his composure, even when my mother pronounced his last name wrong 3 times in one evening, or when my father asked him, twice, what his real career aspirations were, as if teaching wasn't a real career. When Marcus proposed on a rainy Sunday morning on the bridge in the public garden, I said yes before he finished the question. I was so happy I forgot to be afraid of what would come next. But what came next was a phone call from my father's attorney, the trust. My grandfather's attorney had been required to notify the Caldwell family estate executor, who happened to be my father's lawyer, when a triggering event occurred. My engagement was that trigger. $14 million was about to become legally mine. Within 48 hours of that phone call, my parents' behavior changed completely. My mother, who hadn't called me in 3 weeks, suddenly wanted to throw us an engagement dinner. Not just any dinner. A lavish private event at Caldwell and Grace's flagship restaurant in Back Bay. She insisted on handling every detail. She was warm, almost gushing, telling me how happy she was for us, how she couldn't wait to welcome Marcus into the family. My father, the man who had called my fiancé these people, suddenly wanted to discuss wedding plans over cigars. He even offered to cover the entire wedding. I should have seen it clearly, but part of me, the part that had spent 26 years craving their approval, wanted to believe it was real. Maybe the engagement had finally shown them I was serious. Maybe they were coming around. Marcus was skeptical. He didn't say it outright. He never spoke badly about my family to my face, but I could see it in his eyes when I told him about the dinner. That cautious look, like a man checking for ice on the road. Just be careful, Hales, he said, kissing my forehead. People don't change overnight. The engagement dinner was set for a Saturday evening in October. 50 guests. The private dining room on the 2nd floor of the Back Bay restaurant, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Newberry Street. My mother had arranged everything. A raw bar, a 7-course tasting menu, champagne on arrival, and a custom cake from the best pastry chef in Boston. The guest list was mostly my parents' people, business associates, society friends, a state senator they had donated to. Marcus and I had been allowed to invite 10 people each. His mother, Dorothy, flew in from North Carolina where she had recently retired. His best friend, Carlos, came with his wife. My best friend and fellow nurse, Jenna, was there with her husband. A handful of our coworkers and close friends filled out our side. We arrived at 6:30. The restaurant looked stunning. Candles everywhere, white orchids on every table, a string quartet playing in the corner. My mother greeted us at the entrance in a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than Marcus's car, her smile wide and practiced. "You look beautiful, darling," she said, air-kissing my cheeks. And Marcus, so handsome in a suit. She gave him the kind of hug she usually reserved for donors at charity auctions. Brief, performative, careful not to wrinkle anything. My father shook Marcus's hand with both of his, a power move disguised as warmth. "Welcome to the family, son. We're glad you're here." The word son sounded foreign in his mouth, like he was testing a language he didn't speak. The first 2 hours went smoothly. Cocktails flowed. Conversations hummed. and even Marcus began to relax. I watched him laughing with Carlos, talking teaching strategies with one of my parents' friends who sat on a school board, charming Dorothy's seatmate with stories about his students. He belonged here, not because of the venue or the crystal or the 7-course menu, but because he belonged wherever I was. Around 8:15, I excused myself to use the restroom. The private facilities upstairs had a line, a few wives refreshing makeup, so I headed downstairs to the staff restroom I knew from years of visiting the restaurant as a teenager. The kitchen was in controlled chaos, the kind of beautiful organized frenzy that happens in a high-end restaurant during a private event. I slipped past the line cooks toward the back hallway, but stopped when I heard voices coming from the wine cellar alcove just around the corner. My father. And Gerald, the family's attorney. The allergy is severe enough, my father was saying, his voice low and tight. His medical records confirm it. Class 4 shellfish allergy. Even trace amounts of concentrated shrimp protein could trigger a reaction within minutes. Richard, Gerald replied, and I could hear the unease in his voice. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. He'll have a reaction. We'll call 911. He'll be hospitalized. That alone will be enough. Enough for what? I pressed myself against the wall, my pulse hammering so loud I was afraid they could hear it. Enough to delay the engagement. The trust requires a marriage certificate filed within 12 months of the triggering event, or the window closes and the assets revert to the family estate. If he's hospitalized with a severe allergic reaction at their own engagement party, she'll have doubts, she'll postpone. And if the reaction is bad enough, if there's permanent damage, well, a man with chronic health issues isn't exactly marriage material for a young woman with options. A long pause. And if she doesn't postpone? Then we move to the next step. Gerald, I've had my attorney review the trust documents 14 times. If Hailey doesn't marry within the window, the money comes back to us. $14 million that my father never should have put in her name in the first place. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat against the wall to stay upright. My father was planning to poison my fiancé. Not kill him, just hurt him badly enough to derail our engagement and steal my grandfather's inheritance. The nurse in me immediately began calculating. Class 4 shellfish allergy. Concentrated shrimp protein. If Marcus ingested enough, he could go into full anaphylactic shock within minutes. Throat swelling, blood pressure dropping, cardiac distress. Even if epinephrine was administered quickly, there could be complications. And if it wasn't administered quickly enough, in a crowded restaurant where people might assume he was choking or having a panic attack, he could die. My father was gambling with Marcus's life for $14 million. I forced myself to move. Quietly, carefully, I walked back through the kitchen, up the stairs, and into the private dining room as if nothing had happened. My face felt like a mask. I smiled at a passing waiter. I accepted a glass of water from the bar. I found my seat next to Marcus and put my hand on his knee under the table. "You okay?" he asked, reading something in my face he couldn't name. "You look pale." "Just overwhelmed," I said. "All these people here for us. It's a lot." He covered my hand with his and squeezed. "We can leave whenever you want. Say the word." I almost said the word right then. Almost grabbed his hand and walked out of that restaurant forever. But I thought about what would happen next. My father would try again. A different method, a different setting, something I wouldn't see coming. He had Gerald involved. He had a backup plan. If I simply avoided tonight's attempt, I would spend the next 12 months looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next attack would come. I needed evidence. I needed to catch him in the act. The main course was being prepared. I knew the menu by heart because my mother had sent it to me weeks ago, insisting I approve every dish. Course 5 was the centerpiece. Pan-seared halibut with a lemon beer blanc for most guests. But Marcus had a special plate, a grilled chicken alternative, because the restaurant knew about his allergy. Every Caldwell and Grace location had protocols for allergen management. My father would have to circumvent his own restaurant's safety systems to contaminate Marcus's food. I found Jenna near the bar and pulled her aside. "I need you to do something for me right now, no questions asked." Her expression shifted immediately. She had worked beside me in the ICU for 3 years. She knew my no questions asked voice. It was the voice I used when a patient was coding. "What do you need? Start recording on your phone. Discreetly. Point it toward the kitchen pass where they bring out the plates for our table. Get my father in the frame if he goes near it. Hailey, what's going on? Please." I'll explain everything, I promise. Just trust me. She nodded and moved into position near a decorative column that gave her a clear sightline to the kitchen pass-through window. I then found Carlos and quietly asked him to do the same from a different angle. He didn't ask questions either. Marcus's friends were like that, loyal without conditions. And then I waited. The fourth course was cleared. Waitstaff began plating the fifth course in the open kitchen. I watched through the pass-through as the chef carefully prepared Marcus's chicken plate on a separate station, following allergen protocol. A red flag marker sat beside the plate, the standard indicator for allergy-sensitive dishes. My father excused himself from conversation with the state senator. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the kitchen, pausing to speak with the head chef. I couldn't hear what he said, but the chef nodded and stepped away to check something in the walk-in refrigerator. For approximately 40 seconds, my father was alone near the plating station. I watched his hand go into his jacket pocket. I watched him produce a small glass vial. I watched him carefully, methodically, add drops of a clear liquid onto Marcus's chicken plate, specifically onto the sauce. Then he pocketed the vial, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked back to his seat as if he had simply been checking on dinner. My body went cold, then hot, then cold again. The plates began moving from the kitchen to the dining room. Waiters in black vests carried them two at a time with choreographed precision. I could see Marcus's plate, the one with the red allergy flag, making its way toward our table. I had maybe 90 seconds to decide what to do. If I warned Marcus now, quietly, he simply wouldn't eat. But then what? My father would claim the vial contained truffle oil or some other garnish. There would be no proof, no allergic reaction, no evidence of intent. He would try again. If I let Marcus eat the contaminated food, his allergic reaction would be the evidence. The plate could be tested. The vial in my father's pocket could be confiscated. Jenna and Carlos had video. But Marcus could die. Unless I was right there, ready, with exactly the training needed to keep him alive. I am an ICU nurse. I have managed anaphylaxis dozens of times. I know the window. I know the symptoms. I know exactly when to intervene to prevent permanent damage. I also knew that this restaurant, like all Caldwell and Grace locations, kept EpiPens behind the bar as part of their allergen emergency kit. I had seen them myself during family visits. I made my decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. It was the hardest decision of my life. I am not proud of it. I will carry the weight of it forever. But in that moment, with my father willing to gamble on my fiancé's life over money, I chose the path that would end this permanently. I stood up casually and walked to the bar. "Can I see your allergen emergency kit?" I asked the bartender quietly, flashing my hospital ID. "I'm a nurse, and my fiancé has a severe shellfish allergy. I just want to make sure you're stocked." He pulled the kit from under the bar without hesitation. 2 EpiPens, antihistamines, and a printed protocol card. Both EpiPens were in date. I palmed one and slipped it into my clutch, then returned to my seat. The plates arrived. Marcus looked down at his chicken and smiled. "Looks incredible," he said. "Your family really went all out." "They did," I agreed, my voice steady through pure willpower, every detail handled personally. He picked up his fork, cut a piece of chicken, dragged it through the sauce. I put my hand on the EpiPen inside my clutch. He took the first bite, chewed, swallowed, took a second bite. I started counting in my head. At 30 seconds, nothing. Marcus continued eating, chatting with Dorothy about wedding venues. 45 seconds, 1 minute. I began to wonder if I had been wrong, if the vial had contained something harmless, if I had misheard everything in the wine cellar. Then, at approximately 1 minute and 40 seconds, Marcus coughed. He tried to clear his throat, coughed again, harder. His hand went to his neck. His eyes found mine, and I saw the first flash of confusion and fear. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice already thickening. "My throat feels tight. Hailey, my throat." I was already moving. "Marcus, look at me." I took his face in both hands. I could see his lips beginning to swell, hives already forming on his neck. His breathing was becoming labored, each inhale a whistling struggle. "Call 911, I shouted to the room. "Now. He's in anaphylaxis. I need everyone to back up." The room erupted. Guests stood, chairs scraped, someone screamed. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. My mother's face went white. My father stood frozen at the head of the table, his wineglass still in his hand. I pulled the EpiPen from my clutch, uncapped it, and drove it into Marcus's outer thigh through his trousers. The click of the auto-injector was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He gasped. His airway opened slightly, but he was still struggling. I grabbed his hand. "Stay with me. The epi is working. I need you to breathe slowly." I turned to Jenna. "Get the second EpiPen from behind the bar. Now. And bring the Benadryl." She was already running. Marcus's eyes were fixed on mine, wide with terror, his body trembling. I kept one hand on his pulse and the other on his face. I counted his respirations. I monitored for biphasic reaction. I did everything I had been trained to do in the ICU, but with the added horror that this was the man I loved on the table in front of me. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. By then, the second EpiPen had been administered, Marcus's breathing had stabilized, and his blood pressure was holding. He was conscious, terrified, and covered in hives, but alive. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, I turned to look at my father. He was standing exactly where he had been the entire time. He hadn't moved to help, hadn't called 911, hadn't even put down his wine glass. His face was a carefully constructed mask of concern, but his eyes, I knew those eyes. They were calculating, assessing damage, planning next moves. I walked over to him slowly, my legs shaking with adrenaline and rage. In a low voice that only he could hear, I said, "I saw you. The wine cellar, the vial, Marcus's plate. I have 2 people with video of you going near that plate. If you move from this spot, I'm calling the police before the ambulance even leaves the block." His mask cracked, just for a second. Underneath was something I had never seen in my father's face before: fear. Then his jaw tightened and the businessman returned. "You have no idea what you're talking about." But I did, and we both knew it. At the hospital, Marcus was stabilized and admitted for overnight observation. The emergency physician confirmed severe anaphylaxis triggered by crustacean protein exposure. When I told her Marcus had eaten a chicken dish at a restaurant with strict allergen protocols, she raised an eyebrow and reached for the phone to contact the health department. I asked to speak with her privately. "I believe the food was deliberately contaminated," I said. "My father had access to the plate before it was served. I have video evidence, and I'm requesting the hospital preserve Marcus's blood samples for toxicology. There will also be a plate at the restaurant that needs to be secured." She didn't blink. She had worked emergency medicine in Boston long enough to have seen everything. She made 2 calls, one to hospital security, one to the police. Detective Sarah Chen arrived within the hour. She was calm, methodical, and asked questions in a way that told me she was already 3 steps ahead. I walked her through everything. The overheard conversation with Gerald, my father's movements in the kitchen, the video evidence from Jenna and Carlos. She watched both videos on her phone, her expression unchanging. In Jenna's video, you could clearly see my father leaning over the plating station. In Carlos's video, shot from the opposite angle, you could see him put his hand in his pocket immediately after stepping away. "I need to ask you something difficult," Detective Chen said carefully. "You suspected the food was contaminated. You had time to warn your fiancé. Why didn't you?" I looked at my hands. They were still trembling. "Because my father would have tried again," I said quietly. "He had contingency plans. He had the family attorney involved. If I stopped this attempt, the next one might happen when I wasn't there to intervene. I needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. And I needed it to end permanently." She studied me for a long moment. "You let your fiancé eat food you suspected was poisoned." "I am an ICU nurse," I replied, my voice cracking for the first time. "I had an EpiPen ready. I was monitoring his reaction in real time. I intervened within seconds of the first symptom. I know that doesn't make it right. I know I made a terrible choice. But the alternative was living in fear, waiting for the next attack, never knowing when or where it would come. I chose the option that ended it. You also chose the option that nearly killed the man you love." I couldn't answer that. There was nothing to say. She was right. The investigation moved quickly. Police secured the restaurant and recovered Marcus's plate, which tested positive for concentrated shrimp protein in quantities far exceeding any accidental cross-contamination. They also found the glass vial in the inside pocket of the jacket my father had left draped over his chair. A Caldwell and Grace branded chef's jacket from the restaurant's supply closet. The vial contained a concentrated crustacean protein extract, the kind used in allergy testing labs. My father was arrested at our family home at 6:30 the following morning. My mother was taken in for questioning an hour later after detectives discovered she had been copied on emails between my father and Gerald discussing, in carefully coded language, the timeline for addressing the trust situation. Gerald was arrested the same day. His office files revealed a paper trail that went back months. Research into Marcus's medical history, consultations with a food scientist about allergen concentrations, and draft documents for a legal challenge to my grandfather's trust, to be filed if their plan failed. When the news broke, Brooke called me for the first time in weeks. Her voice was small, nothing like the confident marketing director persona she wore like armor. "What's happening? Is this real? Did Dad really do this?" "It's real," I said. "I was there. I saw it." A long silence. Then, Mom told me Marcus was exaggerating his allergies for attention. "She said you were making everything up because you're jealous of the family." She said, "She's lying, Brooke. She's been lying about me for years. They both have." I could hear her crying. She was 23 years old and her entire world was collapsing. Despite everything, despite years of being compared to her unfavorably, despite watching her accept every privilege I was denied, I felt sorry for my sister. She had been their puppet just as much as I had been their scapegoat. We were just controlled in different ways. "Can I come see you?" she asked. Brooke showed up at my apartment that evening with mascara-streaked cheeks and a grocery bag full of ice cream. We sat on my couch and talked for 6 hours straight, the longest conversation we had ever had. She told me about the pressure she felt to perform, the anxiety attacks she hid with makeup, the way our father would remind her weekly that the entire family legacy rested on her shoulders. She told me our mother had been monitoring her phone and social media since she was 16, curating her image like a brand campaign. I told her about the wine cellar conversation, about watching our father contaminate Marcus's plate, about the choice I made and the guilt I carried. "You saved Marcus's life," she said firmly. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't been ready with that EpiPen, if some random person had been responsible for recognizing anaphylaxis in a crowded room, he might not have made it, but I let him eat it. And Dad put it there." Don't confuse who the villain is in this story, Hailey. Marcus was released from the hospital 2 days later. He was quiet on the ride home. Quiet that evening. Quiet at breakfast the next morning. I gave him space, terrified of what his silence meant. Finally, over a cup of coffee he was barely drinking, he said, "I need you to explain something to me." I set down my own cup. "Anything. You knew. Before I took that bite, you knew what was on that plate." "Yes. And you let me eat it." "Yes." His eyes, the same warm brown eyes that had charmed me from a hospital bed 2 years ago, were filled with something I had never seen directed at me. Not anger exactly, more like a wound he was trying to understand. "Why?" I told him everything. The overheard conversation, the backup plans, the trust money, and the 12-month window. The calculation I had made, the horrible, clinical nurse brain calculation that a controlled allergic reaction with immediate intervention was less dangerous than an unknown future attack without warning. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the silence lasted so long I thought he was going to stand up and walk out of my life. Instead, he said, "I'm furious with you. I know, and I understand why you did it. I know that too. Don't ever make a decision like that for me again. My life is not a variable in an equation, Hailey. Not even to save it." I started crying. He started crying. We held each other in our small kitchen and cried for all of it. The fear, the betrayal, the impossible choice, and the fragile, stubborn love that had somehow survived it all. The legal proceedings consumed the next 4 months. My father's defense attorney tried every tactic imaginable, claiming the vial was a cooking ingredient, alleging I had staged the entire incident, even suggesting Marcus had contaminated his own food for a lawsuit. None of it held up against the video evidence, the toxicology reports, the email trail, or the testimony of 3 kitchen staff members who confirmed my father had ordered the head chef away from the plating station. During discovery, the investigation expanded. Forensic accountants found that my father had been siphoning funds from Caldwell and Grace for years, diverting supplier payments into shell companies he controlled. Health department inspectors, prompted by the case, conducted surprise audits of all 23 locations and found widespread code violations that had been concealed through bribes to local inspectors. 3 former employees came forward with stories of being fired after reporting food safety concerns. Most damningly, the FBI became involved when financial records revealed my parents had been evading taxes on offshore accounts for over a decade. The engagement dinner conspiracy was terrible enough, but it had pulled a thread that unraveled an entire tapestry of fraud. My mother, facing federal charges on top of the state conspiracy count, broke first. She agreed to testify against my father in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was devastating. She described a pattern of controlling behavior that went back decades, detailed my father's obsession with the trust money, and admitted that Gerald had presented them with multiple plans to prevent my inheritance, ranging from legal challenges to what they had euphemistically called the medical intervention. My grandfather's trust was officially transferred to me on a Wednesday morning, 3 months after the engagement dinner. The trustees had expedited the process given the circumstances. $14 million. I sat in the attorney's office and signed the papers and felt nothing except tired. The first thing I did was establish a medical fund for Marcus, covering any long-term effects from the anaphylactic episode and therapy for the psychological trauma. The second thing I did was set up a scholarship fund for nursing students from working-class families, named after Grandpa Arthur. The third thing I did was write a check to Brooke for her own therapy, which she had finally started. We got married on a Sunday in April, 6 months after the engagement dinner. Small ceremony, 30 people. The backyard of Marcus's mother's house in North Carolina. Dorothy cooked everything herself, and I am not exaggerating when I say her buttermilk biscuits were better than anything Caldwell and Grace had ever served. Jenna was my maid of honor. Carlos was the best man. Brooke sat in the second row and cried the entire ceremony. Marcus's students had made a banner that read "Congratulations, Mr. T and Ms. Hailey," with hand-drawn hearts and at least 4 spelling errors. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My parents were sentenced the following month. My father received 18 years for attempted assault with a deadly substance, conspiracy, fraud, and tax evasion. My mother received 8 years after her cooperation. Gerald was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years. At the sentencing, my father was given the opportunity to speak. He talked for 12 minutes about his contributions to the restaurant industry, his philanthropic work, the jobs he had created. He described himself as a businessman who had made difficult decisions in difficult times. He never mentioned Marcus by name. He never mentioned the poison. He never looked at me or Brooke. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood and said only this: my grandfather built Caldwell and Grace to bring people together around a table. My father used that same table to try to destroy the person I love most. There's nothing more I need to say. Outside the courthouse, Brooke took my hand. Just like that, without a word. We walked to the parking lot together while reporters shouted questions we didn't answer. A year later, I stood in the break room at Boston General, pouring my 4th coffee of a 12-hour shift, when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It was a photo of a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines and a single word. Ready? I laughed so hard I spilled coffee on my scrubs. One of the other nurses poked her head in. "You okay, Caldwell?" "I'm keeping my married name," I reminded her for the 100th time. "And yes, I'm more okay than I've ever been. I'm Hailey Thompson now. I still work the ICU. Marcus still teaches 11th grade English and still spends his own money on classroom supplies, though now I make sure the supply budget is a little bigger. Brooke graduated from a culinary program last spring and opened a small cafe in Cambridge that donates leftover food to shelters every night. She named it Arthur's. We sold the Caldwell and Grace chain. The proceeds went to a victim restitution fund, employee severance packages, and a food safety advocacy nonprofit that Marcus and I co-founded. It felt right, turning something that had been used to harm into something that protects. Marcus and I don't talk about that night very often. The scar is there, thin and permanent, a reminder that I made a choice I can never fully justify and that he chose to stay anyway. Our therapist says that's what real love looks like. Not the absence of hurt, but the decision to heal together. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I think about my grandfather sitting on that Cape Cod porch, watching the boats. I think about his letter. I think about how he knew, decades before it happened, that I would need protection from my own family. And I think about poison. Not the kind my father put on that plate, but the slower kind, the kind that seeps into a family over generations, the poison of greed and control and conditional love. My grandfather gave me the antidote, not the money, though that helped. The real antidote was his belief that I was enough, exactly as I was. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice to protect someone you love? Have you ever had to walk away from the family you were born into so you could build the family you deserve? I hope my story reminds you that your worth is not determined by the people who raised you, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to swallow what they're serving. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to Solid Revenge for more stories of survival and strength. And remember, the people who are meant to love you will never put poison on your plate. Thank you for listening to my story.